You're tuned in to Evolve, a series dedicated to the evolution of technology, society, and business. With Aarron Spinley. Let's get into the show.
Hey everyone, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for tuning in. You know, around the world today, entire industries are being challenged and shaken up by new challenger brands that have a new way of thinking and a new way of applying operating models. And here's a pro tip. They're not always new companies. And amongst all of that, what we've seen is the rise of neobanks that have really come to symbolize this new breed of business. So I'm absolutely excited today to be unpacking challenger brands with Camilla Cooke, Chief Marketing Officer and co-founder of XINJA Bank. Camilla has around 25 years experience internationally with digital and data-driven businesses, operating as a marketer and a strategist in small businesses, in not-for-profits, and in blue-chip organizations alike. And one of the things that I really like is she spent time as a marketing director for Cure Brain Cancer. Now, XINJA is shaking up the market today, and so I can think of no one better to talk about challenger brands. This will be fun with Camilla Cooke. Now, for those folks tuning in here on YouTube, you'll notice we lost the camera feed for Camilla, but what she has to say is so important. So I've just put up the thumbnail. I really hope you enjoy the audio. And if you want, shoot over to one of your favorite podcast players and you can pick it up there. Thanks for tuning in. Well, hey Camilla, welcome to the show.
Lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
This is about our take 4 or take 5, I think, between scheduling problems and technology problems. And we've got another one today in the cameras, but we're just going to keep rolling and get this done because I'm really keen to hear from you on this subject, which I think is a really, really important one. So look, we did some work together last year for Which 50 Media, where we were talking about brand trust. And, you know, in your particular area around banking and finance, that's obviously a pretty personal and relatable thing to all of us, right? The state of our finances affects our happiness, our well-being, our dreams and our aspirations and our sense of security and all those kinds of things. So for that reason, I think that, banking, finance, challenging or challenger brands are a really interesting place to start thinking, or they're a really interesting test tube environment, if you like, to really break out and unpack a little bit around what challenger brands are doing in the market today. But I want to start a little bit before then. Apparently the common wisdom is that you start at the beginning. You are not only the CMO at XINJA, but you're also a co-founder. And so that's even more personal for you than for others. Take us on that journey. What led Camilla Cooke to this place right now? Who is Camilla Cooke and how did that start?
Okay, well, I think in a way I've swapped in and out of different perspectives. I come from an advertising background, but after spending 20 odd years in advertising and marketing, mostly digital areas, I actually took a jump into the not-for-profit area, into a charity, and was a marketing director of a brain cancer charity in Australia. And that led me to XINJA for 2 reasons. One reason was that I actually worked with a consultant there who was a friend of my current CEO, the CEO of XINJA, Eric Wilson. And so she created the introduction. He asked her if she knew anyone and she recommended me. So literally that's what connected me. But what also connected me was having spent a few years, many years in commercial, and then jumping into a not-for-profit. A group of us were helicoptered into the not-for-profit, and essentially we were very brash and very commercial in comparison to a lot of the people in that industry. But what I became determined to do was to make not-for-profit far more effective by using commercial principles in not-for-profit to really further the cause, right, and to treat it like a business problem and solve that problem. And what not so much me, but my team achieved at Cure Brain Cancer was extraordinary. they actually went on to raise the largest fund that's ever been raised for brain cancer in the world. That's little old Australia, which was $100 million. And it was a very interesting journey, understanding in a way what is broken in the not-for-profits and how they need to take a leaf out of the commercial book. And of course, then I was introduced to Eric, and I was faced with the opposite problem, which is, how do I take my learnings from a highly ethical context and bring those into the commercial world? And the reason I fell in love with XINJA and the reason I picked up the challenge was that all of us founders stated at the beginning and have stuck with the fact that we are for profit and for purpose, and we see no conflict between those two. And we think it's time that businesses were run ethically. So now I'm doing the opposite. I'm looking to bring a business model to XINJA that is also ethical and is not just based on profit. So I've come full circle, if you like.
Okay, that's really interesting. And there's some of that we're going to unpack and get a little bit into further, because you've touched on some really important themes there, I think. Look, for a whole bunch of folk who maybe aren't up with the play of, or the rise, I should say, of neobanks, XINJA is a really great case study. Do you want to tell us a little bit about XINJA?
Sure. Well, XINJA was the brainchild of our CEO, Eric Wilson, and it was born off the back of the success that he'd observed as a banker with the neobanks in Europe. And the great case study is Monzo, which is a bank in the UK that now has over 3 million customers. It's been around about 4 years. So that's actually very, very significant market share in a short. And like XINJA, Monzo was founded on the principle that banking could change and could be designed in customers' interests. One of the co-founders of Monzo was also a great friend and is actually a board advisor to XINJA. And our CEO was working at one of the big 4 banks, and he had a road to Damascus day where he became convinced that the way the bank was operating was actually harming its own customers. And he decided, on his friend's advice, to go and start a brand new bank. And I guess the thing about neobanks is that, yes, of course, as the name suggests, they're brand new, which means in this day and age, they're 100% digital. They're designed for mobile. So you can do all of your banking from an app. You don't need to go to a branch there. Obviously, there's no paperwork, all that kind of thing. And more importantly, they've got brand new technology. Now, that's a huge leapfrog if you consider that the big banks have technology that is getting on for 30 years old.
Right.
It's Jurassic in technology terms, as we all know, because of the exponential change we've seen. So that affords them all sorts of advantages. They're far more nimble. They can operate at a fraction of the cost. Not to mention they don't have any branches, which also reduces their costs, all of which can be passed on to customers in the form of low or no fees, less interest paid, more interest earned. So that makes them potentially highly competitive. But what actually is different is that neobanks are not just trying to do what traditional banks did, which was when digital channels came along, they didn't question the model, which incidentally hasn't changed for about 700 years. They didn't question that banking should change. They just thought it should be forced through digital channels.
Right.
The very fact that they decided to call what we call in England the cash point, but what we call in Australia the ATM, the automatic teller machine. They still had this presence of this teller, this person. And so they related everything to how they'd done it before, and they didn't seek to change banking. They only sought to use a new channel. And I think what characterizes the neobanks is we are here to redesign banking from first principles. So we challenge everything, and we're here to pull it apart and put it back together again, much like a lot of next generation companies these days in different verticals. They're challenging not just the channel, but they're challenging the whole model.
Yeah, very interesting. I think a lot of the people that have heard me speak a bit, one of my pet bugbears that I often talk about is the inability, it seems, for organizations to shift gears or or to put it another way, to actually break out of paradigms and think about the enablement to their business model or to a different version of their business model that the technological advancements bring us. To your point, a lot of what we see is just an iteration of the previous model driven now through a digital channel. So we haven't innovated our business at all. We've just modernized the transaction layer, right? And we see that in a lot of businesses. It's what's interesting to me when I think about sort of some of the challenger brands is this interesting thing that a challenger brand challenges, right? And in order to challenge, there often has to be someone to challenge. There's a cool quote from Dave Thomas, who founded Wendy's in 1969, and he said that he owed McDonald's a tremendous debt of gratitude because they gave him something to look good against, which I like because it's cheeky. And it's interesting that often in challenger brands and brands that are, or anything really that's challenging the status quo, sometimes there's that cheekiness, there's that sort of gumption almost that's sort of part of their DNA. But sometimes I wonder in a perverse kind of way if the big guy, the guy that you're chasing, right, the big market incumbent, because you're challenging them, sometimes, you know, your identity becomes about them in a perverse kind of way, if that makes sense. How do you, in that sense, make sure, and in your context, you know, people talk about XINJA as challenging the big banks, right? It's kind of like an extension of the sentence, not XINJA who is a contemporary or a new generation banking provider, right? It tends to always find its way back to the incumbent institutions that you're challenging. So the question I have is, how do you break out of that? How do you find and maintain your own sort of true north, your own identity in that, so that your identity doesn't become about who you are challenging?
That's a fascinating question. I agree with you. As a communicator, I hate the concept of defining myself by what I'm not. And it's such a negative positioning. And when I was looking at as XINJA began, I was looking at all the taglines of all the neobanks around the world. And a lot of them were exactly that. So they would be the bank of the future, for example, or they would be a different kind of bank. So they were all referential to the status quo. And we came up with a tagline, how money should be. And what we were talking about actually was very much in the positive, which is a celebration of what money can yield. If only we could be engaging and sensible around it. And if only we could make it easy for people to do that. You know, what wonderful joy it could yield and how much stress we could remove from people's lives. So we actually have been quite upbeat. We're very upbeat and we're great fun, and we look at things in that way, rather than doing what a lot of my colleagues refer to as bank bashing. And it is a risk for anyone in our position. And we are goaded into it, needless to say, by the media. They are continuously asking us to comment in a way that's adversarial. And however positive about our other banking colleagues we are, and however much we avoid that comparison, you can be sure that the headline will be a negative about the incumbents. And so the narrative is very much forced by the media, I would argue. But I think there's plenty of scope to talk in a positive way about money. And some of that is about disbanding the taboos and allowing the conversation. And some of that is about asking, as we do, our customers come up with inspiration for not what they hate. And we do let them vent because they need to get stuff off their chest. But we also say, never mind that, how about dreaming? What would you love? Yeah. And so you can flick the conversation to the possible, not the negatives we're coming from. And nice. I think every time we do that, we win. So it's an ongoing battle. Occasionally you have to resort to the shorthand. And what's quite interesting, again, coming from the not-for-profit area, was quite interesting. What I tried to do at Cure Brain Cancer was that traditional communications, for example, around cancer is incredibly miserable and negative. And it has become wallpaper and it's become ineffective. If you think of slow-mo video of child possibly without hair sitting in hospital bed holding, you know, teddy bear, to minor key music that's very somber, that is your standard issue cancer advertisement. I went out and said, well, actually what we need to get excited about is the cure and the extraordinary human creativity behind the science and the incredible personalities. Now, we did do an awful lot of that and it worked. But when I first started, someone said, but no one's aware of this cancer. You've got to jolt them into awareness. And I ended up doing just what I despise, which was to be sad and somber and hit someone with a hard fact in what was actually quite a traditional way. But having kickstarted the conversation with that quick shorthand, with that, let me get your attention, with something you can easily understand, it was quite easy to flip the conversation to the positive, and we had a lot of success in so doing. And I'm finding the same with XINJA. Challenge, you know, define yourself by what you're doing, not by what you're not doing.
Right, right. It's an interesting way, you know, and I was doing some research for this. I was really interested in the work of the XINJA project out of the UK, and should shout out and acknowledge Adam Morgan and his team up there. And I liked this. They said, and let me just put my glasses on so I can read it. When they're talking about challenger brands, they said, these brands are less about business entity and more about an often mission-driven desire to progress the category in some way in the customer's favor. Now, I know that proposition, well, I like that proposition, not that makes it true or valid just because I like it, but I do like it. And I think there's a lot of startups around the place that are more about the exit, and that's commercially valid, right? But there's also a large proportion that have this real sense of sort of social responsibility that's kind of in their DNA. And I know you well enough, I think, to know that sense of progressing something in the customer's favor. And you've already sort of touched on it already in our conversation, that kind of resonates with you as well. So when you think about that in context of XINJA, in context of personal banking, or however you might define that, what is that notion of progressing the category in the customer's favor mean to you?
Well, we call it the win-win. So in other words, it's perfectly possible to run, there's plenty of money in money, you know, there's plenty of money in banking. And it is perfectly possible to run a highly profitable business whilst serving the interests of your customers. That's why we say we are for profit and for purpose, and we see no conflict between the two. And I think at the technology, to a large extent, the acceleration of technology has lowered costs and improved services to such an extent that it's much easier for us to do this. It's much harder for a big old-fashioned bank with all their old legacy systems that move like dinosaurs. It's much easier for us to deliver a good service and to focus our effort and our resource on helping customers make more out of their money. And there's a real why not about this. And I think that is true, and a lot of challenger brands, a lot of next generation companies are saying, well, why can't we change it? Why can't it be win-win? And there's some really obvious, you know, business arguments for this, that if you look after your customers better, you help them make more out of their money, you give them great service, then lo and behold, they stay with you longer, they take out more products with you, and they recommend you to their friends. And it's a real kind of no shit Sherlock moment when you realize that actually that model works, and there's all sorts of reasons why it works really well now. So I think the main thing for us is, part of challenging the category is to say, well, it doesn't have to be this way. Let's do it in a really positive and beneficial way to our customers. And I think that to come full circle, arguably, you could say that banking used to be like that back in the day, that possibly we're recycling an ethos that did exist. Our CEO also says that he was inspired by his father-in-law, who was a regional bank manager in Australia. And he observed him as a pillar of the community in a small country town, whilst he gently guided his customers to make better decisions and not get into trouble. And somewhere along the line, that relationship has become at best transactional and at worst adversarial. And the industry ended up in conflict with himself. But when you dismantle it and you go back to the drawing board, you realize there's no need. And actually you can reconstruct it around their interests and do very well.
Yeah. Again, interesting. And I'll come back to a couple of the notions in there. If I stick with the Challenger project for a minute, they think there are four main characteristics of a Challenger brand. And when I read through them, they resonated with me, but then I'm not running a Challenger brand like you are. So I'd love to get your views on that. The first one they call out, and many of these are universal probably, but the first one they call out really strongly is the ability to tell a story. How does that resonate with what your work at XINJA?
I think with us, we are passionate about the fact that we want to help people make more out of their money. And to do that, we need to engage them. We fundamentally believe that if you make managing your money engaging, then people will get better at it. So right. we need to have them leaning in. And to get someone leaning in, they need to be listening. And if you want them to listen, then storytelling is a key component. So in our case, I would say that it's about storytelling is fundamentally human, and it's about bringing humanity to the communication. Now you do that in a myriad ways. One of those is you kill legalese, you kill jargon, you kill confusing language, which has beleaguered banking for a long time. And we focus really hard on speaking clearly and succinctly.
Right.
The other thing is that you tell the stories of your customer, you tell the stories of your customers, but you tell the stories of your staff, of your partners. To build trust in banking, making us into human beings is a really core component of what we do. Right. Because you trust someone that you've met and seen and understand. We run a series called The Secret Lives of XINJAs and XINJAs After Hours, where we just showcase our staff and they talk about why they're working at XINJA and they talk about what drives them and so forth. And it has a very humanizing effect. And similarly, we do that with our customers, that they become very real for someone if they're just speaking out. Now, these are not sort of cliche customer testimonials. They don't actually talk about XINJA, they talk about themselves. So think Humans of New York rather than, traditional testimonial, which talks about the brand. And I think bringing that humanity to all the connections with XINJA is a key part of telling the story. And that's something we will always prioritize. So there are lots of different ways in which we make it more of a human conversation and more of a story. I think the other thing is we are prepared to talk about the fundamental areas of money that impact us, again, as human beings, and whether that's the emotional aspects of money, that the impact it has on our lives, the impact it has on self-esteem, the impact it has on our families, and so forth. These are all, and on different segments in society. Being prepared to talk about this and going there is a really key aspect of drawing people in. And they do want to hear stories, and they do want to listen, and they do want to contribute. And listening to customers and letting them tell their stories in a short or a long form is a key part of what we do through all our communications.
Yeah, interesting. There was a study not long ago where about 200 brand marketers cited storytelling or asked about storytelling, and half of them said it was the number one thing that a challenger brand really has to do. And the reason I find that interesting is I think that the fact that it's only half of them is crazy. I feel like it should be like 110% of them with that view in many ways, because especially now when we're trying to create experiences that engage people and create memories and emotions, which is very much how we drive brand today, the storytelling is really kind of central to that. The second thing, the second characteristic that Challenger Project calls out is, again, general, but I think quite important now, and it opens up an interesting subject around new versus old brands and the way you execute this. But what they call out is authenticity, right? So for me, when you hear the word authenticity, it's, you know, it's almost like becoming one of those new buzzword bingo games when you know, how many people can say transformation and disruption, and right, authenticity is one of those new ones that's becoming very, very common. And what happens a lot when you get common use of the term is people actually stop critically thinking about it. They just say it. So when you think about authenticity in your context and in being a challenger brand, what does that mean to you?
In a way, XINJA is selling transparency and honesty and authenticity. We say that we are here to help people make more of their money. Now, the key thing with that is not to say it. If someone comes to you and says, I'm a really caring person, in many cases that might put your shackles up. It's a bit like someone saying, I've got a great sense of humor. Probably means you couldn't tell a joke to save your life. Yeah. Anyone with a sense of humor does not say they have a sense of humor. And being caring or noble or brave are attributes that other people give to you. The moment you give them to yourself, they are suspect. And one of the things I say to all our staff is never, ever say you care. Care is something you do. It is not something you say about yourself. And so authenticity comes from walking the walk for me. And we show that we care. We actually help them make more out of their money. We deliver a brilliant service. We never go out and say that we really care about people. And it's easy for people to lapse into it and say, we really, you know, we're so lovely and we really care about the customer. I don't encourage people to use the term customer centric. It's become meaningless. It's just something people say. It's not something they mean. And authenticity is about meaning it, and that means doing it and not saying it. So that's very much our approach. And I think the other thing is that never take yourselves too seriously. You start drinking your own Kool-Aid, you become arrogant, you think you're Mother Teresa. We are not Mother Teresa, okay? And we need to be very clear with that. And part of that, in our case, is humor. Now, we're a very cheeky brand. We crack a lot of jokes. And the reason for that is humor will cut through that kind of schmaltzy self-adulation like a knife. So one of the things I say is never say you care and never take yourself that seriously. And that is actually how we keep ourselves on the path. We have a phrase here, which is ask yourself, what would XINJA do? And I ask the staff always to stop and think for a moment how they would handle the situation. And if I ever find any of them putting slightly schmaltzy language into any of their communication, I edit the hell out of it, or I berate them for doing so. So I think humility is the key to authenticity.
Yeah, I love that, because, and there's a part of what I wanted to talk about which sort of touches on that sort of arrogance that rises sometimes when you have an organization that is, I was going to say, very mission centric, but it's really more they just drink a lot of Kool-Aid and language can play an important role in that. So that's interesting. A lot of brands kind of get lost in that today, right? They feel like the world is moved and they have to have some higher purpose, and that's fine. But there's this lack of authenticity, and when you don't have that, it sort of doesn't settle back to neutral. It tends to harm your brand because you have this kind of fraudulent sense to what's going on. So
absolutely,
really interesting though. I hadn't thought about humor as a weapon in that particular challenge. So the third one they call out is about caring for community. And we've kind of touched a little bit on this around the customer side. You talked about customer centricity and not talking about that because, and I like that as well, because, you know, to me, I often say to executives, customer centricity is not an attitude, it's an operating model. And if you don't enable it, it ain't going to happen because you implore people to behave in a certain way.
Yeah, absolutely.
So in terms of caring about community then, I guess, you know, that's customer as well. You can hear some of the traditional folk almost starting to get worried we're going to start singing Kumbaya here. But the reality is that society has moved in that way, right? We like to engage with brands that have a meaning or have some interrelationship to us that's beyond the transaction, and make a difference in some way.
Mm-hmm.
What does that mean for you when you think about caring for community? Because it's a wider context than just customer, right?
Yeah, and I think, again, this is where I kind of bring very much my not-for-profit head to some of this. I think if we look, in the old days, we talked about CSR, corporate social responsibility. Now we talk about social impact strategy. XINJA has at its heart a social impact agenda, which is that we want to help people make more out of their money. That is our purpose. And so we are purpose driven. So in a way, it's what we do every day. It's fundamentally is trying to help the community that is our customers do better, get out of debt faster, all those good things, and have a less stressful life. And I think that the key thing here is the obvious extension beyond our core purpose, if you like, but into building that around other communities or extending it to actually give back. Essentially the areas that we think about and we feel as a bank we need to face head on there are some pretty big levers out there that impact whether people make the most out of their money. There's some really obvious ones, right, that can adversely affect people, that need, that are societal issues that need addressing, from the gender financial gap being a huge one, through housing affordability, for example, through gambling. Australia is an appalling predicament with its gambling. It's terrifying how much money families are losing to gambling. It's tragic. Right. And at the other end of the scale, the unbanked. There's all sorts of data globally that will tell you that if you put a bank account into someone's possession, their personal economic prospects increase significantly and immediately. So these are all big, hairy areas. We've got a sort of section on our community forum called DNMs, and we talk about these big areas of thought and we invite debate on them. And for us, we have to stay focused on our core purpose, and that's how we're going to benefit the community, and that is to deliver what we say we're here to deliver. But right. Of course, you can imagine that we are thinking about these other areas, because we can tweak the dials on people's finances, but we can't ignore elephants in the room like these big ones that are really having huge impacts. So this is definitely something we talk about a lot. It's definitely something we have plans for. And it's definitely something that in certain areas we're looking to build into our product itself. In other words, how do we address some of these? So without giving too much away, you can expect to see from us this year, one of these big topics, you can, see us do more than talk about it and bring it up. We've actually got an action plan that you're going to see in the app, which impacts it directly. So, watch this space.
Well, that's a great segue, because the last characteristic that that they call out is purpose. And you've kind of covered that pretty well. But again, one of the things that when I'm talking to people, I'm interested in their purpose. I'm interested in two levels. One, again, back to this notion of authenticity. Can I detect their operating system actually enabling what they're saying about themselves and their purpose? Or is it kind of a thin veneer that's more of a marketing play as opposed to something that has that kind of genuine authenticity? I go looking for that. But one of the things that I go looking for is action, which is kind of the word you've just used then. Mm-hmm. When you're effectively, when the rubber hits the road, do you actually try and affect the change that you talk about there? Do you think that's, clearly you've just given a pretty strong indication that's part of the DNA of XINJA and some exciting announcements coming later this year around that. Do you think that is common within newer organizations? And I'm cautious to say challenger brand because, we can cover that the challenger brand isn't necessarily a new organization, but for those that have a challenger mindset, do you think that kind of purpose to action piece is part of the DNA in general?
I think I can't speak for all of them, but I think, yes, we are seeing business models emerge that benefit the company and society. And they are business models. And that is the key to purpose. It is no use having a purpose unless it is tied to your own success. Right. Because I always say we cannot rely on the next generation of XINJAs. You know, bad thinking human beings are evenly distributed through the population, and some will walk through these doors at some point. Now, if our staff are incentivized financially, in a business sense, and selfishly in terms of their own career or financial advancement, to actually help customers, we can rely on them to do so. What we cannot do is rely on goodwill, because goodwill can falter. It's not definite. We can't rely on them to do the right thing. There are bad apples everywhere, and it's not controllable. Right. And we have seen this in hideous examples across the banking industry. It's not just about we're going to lead from the top and we're going to be jolly nice. No, that doesn't work. Finance attracts greed. Greed on the whole tends to trample on other people's well-being. And therefore, you have to build it into your business model. So I'm being very pragmatic here. I'm saying if we tie our success to our customers, we will succeed, and we will succeed more. There are lots of operational examples of this. For example, I often get challenged when people say to me, if something goes wrong, for example, with our customers, there might be a minor glitch. They got a card delivered late, or there was something wrong with their app, or something negative happened and we know about it. Our XINJArati, our customer support team, will often send quite a generous pack to those people. So it might have a bit of, comic XINJA merch in it, like some XINJA chocolate or some XINJA beer. So there might be some branding in it, or it might be a bunch of flowers. It could be anything. It might be something humorous related to what happened to them. Right. And that can cost quite a lot of money to actually put that in a package in the post, and think of the resource costs of someone going to do that. And so I often get challenged, and people saying, well, you can't afford to do that at scale. That's ridiculous. Well, actually I can. Because if you sit for a moment and model the impact of treating that customer well, of apologizing, making up for it in good service, and making up and acknowledging it and giving them a gift, to say sorry, and going to the trouble of writing a handwritten card, the impact on that person is enormous. They trust you more, they recommend you more. And we've even had loads of people posting it on social media. So you've got someone, rather than who is going out and bad-mouthing XINJA, which has a negative impact on our profit, you've got someone out there who is probably, you've turned into an advocate. And that person is going to recommend you to their friends. And that person is also, as I say, going to potentially even amplify that through digital media. Yeah. Now,
and look, that stuff's classic long lifetime customer value.
Exactly.
Thinking,
exactly.
Right?
Exactly. And so that's just one example of how you build it into your model and your operational model, as you said, to service the customer better. And one of the things I do say about our purpose, which is to help people make more out of their money, is if we stick to it, I think we will succeed. If we veer from it, I think we will fail. And so part of my job is to motivate the company to remind themselves it's not, this is not lipstick on a pig. This is who we are. And it's actually how we do well. And I think if you bring those two things together, then you can triumph in both, in your customers' terms, but also in your own terms.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We sort of live in a time when brands are trying to be more human, and human beings are trying to be more like brands. And for a company like a XINJA or a neobank in general, that's, it's a digital bank. There's no storefront. It's all mobile first, it's almost not mobile first. It's mobile only, just about, right?
That's right. Yeah.
That you could very easily be described as a 100% digital organization, but what you described then as an initiative around, resolving a concern in a very human way. You talked about handwritten cards and flowers or chocolates. That's not very digital at all.
No.
But I love it because it's really, people get caught up around whether you're digital or not, right? And we talked earlier about some companies that are really just modernizing transaction layers and haven't changed their think. The think that I really value is where you have this genuine human centricity and you don't care what channel, if I can, put channel in inverted commas, where that comes from, because it's about, again, you have a relationship with someone. A lot of brands forget about this human relationship dynamic. So it's quite interesting that a digital organization resolves a problem in a very, if I can use the term, analog way.
Absolutely. And I think that there's all sorts of ways we look to bring humanity back to banking, which is kind of what we're about. And ironically, possibly it will be technology that allows us to do that the most. But these other touch points are important. XINJA are on shore, and we go by our names. So most of the time, sometimes we forget, but if we're commenting back on social media, we use our own personal first names. If a lot of the people on we have funny XINJA names, which we use, and I use those, we use those as our username on the forum, for example, but I will often respond as Cam. And I've now got loads of customers who will, chime in and want to have a chat with Cam. And also I get to meet them, which is amazing. So we run a lot of meetups, and it is an incredible moment when you've had a digital, as a lot of us experience in other contexts. But last year, actually, I think when I met you, Aarron, I was down in Melbourne, and I just had a customer meetup, and this guy walks through the door, and I started talking to him, and I went, "Oh my God, it's you!" And we'd been talking to each other for 2.5 years on the forum, and it was just a wonderful moment to actually. And I gave him a hug, and it was just like, wow, they were meeting real people. So we maintain, for a digital-only organisation with only one office, we maintain a huge amount of human contact.
That's really interesting. On the run sheet, when I was thinking about, sort of prepared questions for you, this next section was going to be around trust, but we've covered that so many ways in terms of not just messaging, but identity and operating model. And I feel like if I asked you that question, you just have to repeat yourself. But what's really come out is a theme of community, right? And you talk about your meetups, and you talk about the forums that you've got. There's very kind of personal sense. And I think the great brands that are nailing their growth strategy today have managed to kind of create this very personal vibe in everything they do. And that community and that ecosystem is really important in that space too. If I flip the lens a little bit though, because we're talking a lot about customer and brand perception and identity and that kind of stuff, but that's true internally too, right? If I think about people that join a challenger brand, if they want to become a XINJA, right?
Yeah.
They're often, people that are driven by, again, perhaps that sense of social commitment or responsibility, or that they just really buy into the mission, or they're connected somehow through that community we talked about. And you're someone that went on that journey in an even more personal way, because you have to start the thing. So, there's risk rewards. You would have had a sense of stepping into the unknown. And I just wonder if perhaps, the type of people, in your estimation, is it true that you get perhaps a different flavor of human that wants to join a challenger brand or an early stage? And if that's the case, also, what does that do more longitudinally for your culture?
Well, I think it helps our culture enormously at this stage. Now, all cultures break every 50 people. This has not been a joyride, I can tell you. No pleasure cruise, as Freddie would have said. We started as 5, and then we were 15, and then we were 25. We're now 85 people. No, we're more than that. I think we've topped the ton, I think. So at an incredible breakneck speed. The CEO is just waking up to the fact that he might not remember everyone's name as of next week. He might not have had a personal conversation bar the original interview. How long is he going to be able to interview 100% of people? I think he'll probably still do that, to be honest. But I think we're breaking through all those barriers and going through all the pain that any company has suffered from time immemorial how do we, your culture's breaking every 50, how do we keep it going? How do we keep that,
right.
that sense alive? And we are very fortunate in that a lot of people do come to XINJA because they've read our 10 golden rules, the first of which famously is, of course, no dickheads. And I think that they buy into the culture and they want to be part of it. And that helps us enormously because we're starting off on the right foot. And there's a couple of ways, though, that so to some extent, reminds me of when I worked actually on I did some work for political parties on campaigning. And I was actually recruiting for resource on that. And that was one of those occasions where I thought, does it matter how this person who's a perfectly good technician, is going to vote? And actually, I remember thinking at the time, yes, it bloody does. I need them to want this to succeed in that case. It was not a dispassionate situation. And one of the things I do ask people at interview is I say, why do you want to come to XINJA? And if they've shown absolutely no interest in the company and they haven't bothered to go to our website and they know nothing about us, then I have to say I'm very disinclined to hire them. But sometimes needs must. You've got to get people through. And so how do we keep that alive, and how do we build it through the organization, the overall culture? And one of the key ways we do is actually through the XINJArati, our support team. So the model for our XINJArati is that they come in as XINJArati, so they're customer support people, which in some ways is a really hard and often thankless task. It's not, you deal with lovely customers on the phone, you can also deal with some really tough situations, and it can be grim. And therefore, it's typically, not an illustrious career, just, answering the phone, etc. However, the model with us is we invite them in on that level, but we deliberately hire people who we see as having great potential and who are very highly skilled. And what that means is that we do have very intelligent, resourceful people on the phone who are very good at problem solving and will think quickly on their feet and really work out how to mend things for people. But then what we do is we give them a career path through the organization. So I'm thinking of 4 off the top of my head. One of them is now a data scientist. He's a brilliant developer and also a data scientist. One of them is now part of the fraud team. One of them is actually head of the bank account product. So she started on the phones and she's now running bank account product. Another is about to join me in marketing. So we take them through the organization. Now, those people started at the coalface with the customers. So if you want to take the culture through the organization, literally move the people through the organization. They never forget those 6 months or the year or however long they had in that role, and they take it into everything they do. And it's a brilliant way of, it sounds really negative, but like a virus spreading through. The fact is they infect everyone, but with that enthusiasm as they go. And then the other thing we do with all our new staff is they also need to meet the customers. We feel to connect them with those customers is critical. And so everyone who comes here actually has to sit on the phone and, answer a call and actually walk a mile in the shoes of the customer support team. And we're looking to take that further, which is at a cultural level, which is to actually make us all walk a mile in each other's shoes. So I said to the chief technology officer the other day, I said, when you're running XINJAfication next, and XINJAfication is our kind of onboarding process, I said, I don't care if they're the receptionist or a designer or someone from the finance team, you need to teach them to write code. You're going to do it for 4 hours so that they know they've got an inkling of what your day is like. And so I think we're trying to bring that empathy for the customer, but also build that empathy with each other, because that is the way we will survive, is actually probably by being kind to each other.
It's a really interesting one, this, to me, because what a lot of brands, early stage brands, startups, scale ups, challenges, whatever you want to call them, sometimes forget is that if they are successful in their mission, then they're going to be here for a long time, right? They're going to become a 5-year-old company and a 10-year-old company, and one day there'll be a 30-year-old company. And the challenger mindset will probably be, you know, if you think about the pace of societal change continuing to escalate, if that's even possible, that challenger mindset as an incumbent could be just as important as when you're starting the journey as well. And I'm really interested in language and how we cultivate that inside businesses, because one of the things you've talked about this a little bit. We talked before around, you know, the Wendy's example where, you know, they've got this language that they talk about being a feisty. They like to be feisty, right? And if I think about a company that I've had some recent engagement with, they love the word scrappy, right? And they're like nearly 20 years old, and they still describe themselves as a startup, which is quite a reach today's, and how quickly we move today. But they're trying to hold on to this, you know, this vibe they're trying to build in their business. So they're interesting. They're at the 20-year mark, and they're trying to maintain that. A previous company I worked with, which was in the creative space, talked about, you know, their way. So insert company name way, right? So the XINJA way, or the company way. So there's always these sorts of dynamics that flow with it. But also one of my observations is that sometimes, and you could imagine, and this isn't a commentary to Wendy's at all, I don't have the exposure to comment at all, but words like feisty sometimes in a business almost gives rise to excuse making for a bit of shorthand or a bit of mediocrity, a bit of we're just getting stuff done, right, and not doing things well. And I've seen that as well. So how do you balance that, you know, that drive? And I love, what did you call it? The XINJification for your onboarding. And I love the use of language. It always fascinates me. How do you make sure that you get the right constant outcomes? I guess that's a segue to leadership, right? How do you, what are the pillars of leadership that really make this sustainable over the long term as you grow?
This is the biggest challenge we have. So I think that there's a couple of things in that. We're a bank, so we have to be so buttoned down, you would not believe, you know. We are the most buttoned down industry in the most regulated market probably in the world. We've got the regulators eating us for lunch, checking everything we do. So as you can imagine, we have hired people through our risk, compliance, security departments, operations, finance, you can imagine, whose job it is to formalize process to a significant degree, and to ensure that every I is dotted and every T is crossed. It's par for the course. It's what we are. And I think that we are a little bit, and so we can rely on them. It is in their nature to be that incredibly reliable, organized, process-driven, that will create an infrastructure and an operational model that will sustain and will be reliable and protects our customers from all the things that might occur. So on the other hand, we've got a whole load of bonkers designers and people from outside the industry, myself included, who are constantly wandering around going, well, why do we have to do it like that? Why can't we do it like this? We are both vital ingredients to this organization. And in a way, it's fire and ice, okay? It's oil and water. Will we ever become each other? No, of course we won't. And going back to your feisty, it's actually one of the words we use about ourselves. And one of our 10 golden rules says, you know, we're going to have arguments, and that's okay. You know, we're going to speak frankly with each other, and we will argue, and we will. But that's, to be honest, where the magic comes from. Now, you talk about sustaining XINJA as a culture in the long term. It's actually by keeping that, I don't want to say conflict, but that energy. If you think, it's the classic love affair, isn't it? It's the classic two characters that fight, the Beatrice and Benedict, or whoever it might be. And you've seen them sort of sparring off each other. And yet it's because that's actually what's driving the attraction. And in fact, there's a huge energy created, and that's where creativity comes from. So I think if we carry on hiring from both sides of that spectrum, that will keep us awake, you know, and it will also keep us secure. So that's our, that's one of the ways I think that we will be able to scale and retain something of who we are and not just become the brand of yesteryear. And I think the point is also that we will become the brand of yesteryear. Every brand does to some extent. And what that will look like, however, is that we will have changed banking, I hope. We will be a contributor to a change at least. And that actually we'll all be operating in a slightly different way. And that will be ours and other neobanks' contributions. And in 20 years, you won't be saying neobank, you'll just be saying bank. I mean, in fact, in 4 years, we'll be saying bank. This is typical of it, this is what banking looks like these days, And so I think to some extent we can sustain like other organizations. The other thing that we can also do is they reinvent ourselves all the time, and not reinvent ourselves, but keep actually focusing on what we're trying to do. It's an endless journey. So there is a lot of creative energy that needs to persist for us to continue to work out in an ever-changing context how to help people make more out of their money. And as everything changes around us, that will stimulate us further. So I think we can keep the fire alive by the nature of our own productivity, by not creating a system that we never change. On the contrary, one of the things we see everything through is constant curiosity. And to stay ahead, we're going to have to do that. So innovation is part of our DNA. So if innovation is what we do all the time, by our very nature, we're keeping ourselves alive, awake, and ever-changing.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, if you read or talk to any of the great philosophers, we seem to be in this perpetual cycle in humanity where we keep having to learn the same lessons over and over again.
Yes.
And so we have this challenge, right, that if we are shaking up, what is the perceived errors of the incumbents today, when we are the incumbents ourselves, will we be just the next generation of incumbents making perhaps the same errors as we run into new problems due to scale or whatever, and just thought about it in the same way? So there's this, if macro history teaches us anything, it teaches us that. So there's this kind of baked in challenge, right? In terms of how we truly make the change, but not just make the change, but deliver the change in a sustainable way.
It was interesting. I was saying it was interesting. One of the things I was saying to the team the other day was talking about putting us in the context of a next generation company. And I sort of said, if we were car service, we'd be Uber. If we were a entertainment company, we'd be Netflix, if we were, and I said, if we were a car company, we'd be Tesla, we wouldn't be Ford. And that was actually, then I realized, I looked back at that statement and I realized that one of the things I have at the back of my mind and my shorthand when I'm thinking about how do you redesign from first principles, and how do you have to take what your customers request with a pinch of salt. And of course, Henry Ford famously said, if you ask them what they want, they'll tell you a faster horse. And that's something that was echoed obviously by Steve Jobs, but the motor car would never have been born. And ironically, he was one of the biggest disruptors of the 20th century, if you think of his impact, and of society. And so, and weirdly, yet we think now of Ford as this traditional company. And so I think that's just evidence of the fact that you do inexorably become part of the old guard, but let's hope you've had a bloody good impact along the way.
And it's a great example. I often tell people it depends, when you're iterating, to use that term, then you're in a current paradigm, and you can ask people what they think and what they want because they understand the paradigm, they've been in it. But when you change the paradigm, like Henry Ford did, and others, then asking customers what they want is a pretty tough ask because they don't understand the place you're trying to take them to. So it depends on the scale and the type of innovation that we're talking about. Because we're right at kind of the start of this sort of new decade now, everyone's running around making predictions, and I won't put you on the spot around too much of a prediction, but if you could, if it was 2030 and you were looking back on the decade, right, even from a macro sense in banking, or perhaps micro just with XINJA, what would you like to have seen happen?
I think that in 2030, I'd like to see all banks being able to measure as part of their earnings and part of the metrics they're taking to the market and to their shareholders every quarter. I'd like them to see reports on the financial well-being of their customers. So I would like to see hard metrics on how they have improved the financial well-being of their customers as something as standard that the reporters report on every quarter. So I would like to see that being part of the shareholder value and the valuation of that company. Yeah. And I think that in a way is the driest but most tangible thing I can think of that shows we've made a difference. I would also like to say that they can measure the impact they've had on the GDP even. And I was very inspired by our chair, Lindley Edwards, who was chairman of the People's Bank of Vanuatu. And she took a financial literacy program to quite an impoverished community there, written amazingly in Pidgin English. I highly recommend reading it. It's quite amusing. But the point was that she actually increased the GDP of that country. I think that is incredible. Wow. Yeah. And she did that through technology and financial education. And I think that I'd love to think that we are seriously impacting Australians and potentially other people around the world in terms of their individual financial well-being, and that there is empirical evidence for the fact that we've done that.
And what a great mission that is. What a great mission that is. What I'd love to do before we close here, and I ask this of all the guests that come on, because, well, they're just experienced, creative, insightful, they're all generous. And so I ask for their advice, and it can be anything. Life, it can be banking if you like, leadership, culture, anything you like. You can be Auntie Camilla if you wish, for as long as you want to take it here. What would you like to leave with people before we close this off today?
That's a tough one. I think probably be prepared to work bloody hard. That's very obvious, and it's frightening. But if you want to make waves and you want to do anything, it all comes partly talent, but largely from working very hard. So I think just brace up and do that. And the world is your oyster. I think that's definitely one of those things. And the second thing I would say that if you're worried, and I think I'm misquoting Eleanor Roosevelt here, but if you're worried about what people are thinking of you, they're probably not thinking about you at all. So relax and never take yourself too seriously. And those two combinations will make you a fantastic member of any team. And if you can be a fantastic member of a team, you can achieve anything you want to achieve.
Perfect. I love it. And such timeless advice. Sometimes we get caught up in our new eras or our new thinking or whatever. But it's just the tried and true and the lessons of humanity we need to come back to sometimes, isn't it? So Camilla, on that note, thank you so much for hanging out and giving us your thoughts. I'm fascinated by challenger brands. I'm fascinated by neobanks, and we'll do this in 4 years and just call you a bank, and that'll be fun.
Okay, fantastic.
But thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. Really enjoyed it.